China has been around for 5,000 years. No, they haven't. That's a myth. And it's such a contentious myth that there's a whole Wikipedia debunking that notion. Go to any historic encyclopedia and they will tell you that the first Chinese dynasty began around 3,700 years ago under the Shang. The accounts of China existing for more than 5,000 years goes into the prehistory of China, before any organized city-state, before any dynasty. And when you're going into historic civilizations, we have to see the first dynastic rule. Ancient Egypt is a perfect example. They were around 3300 BC. They're about 5,300 years old, maybe a little bit older. And we know that because of the first writings of the dynastic rule, if you want to call it writing, because this was even before hieroglyphics. But that's not what started the Egyptian-like culture, because if you want to go even deeper, there is the Egyptian Stonehenge called Nabta Playa, and that's 7,500 years old. But that is not considered Egyptian history or Egyptian civilization. That's why even though there were prehistoric Chinese societies way back when, just like there were in Japan, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, North America, South America, or the Indus Valley, that wasn't their first kingdom. At the very least, not a centralized civilization as we know it. But either way, it is a very old culture that deserves a great respect and place in history. But that doesn't give them any huge advantage over the United States or anybody, really. When China was still incredibly old, they were conquered by the Mongols, a much younger society, and they were ruled under that Yuan dynasty for about 2 centuries. By the 1600s, they were conquered by the Manchus, and that was the Qing dynasty, which persisted until the early 1900s. Over the past few hundred years, we just assume that Manchuria is China, but 400 years ago, even earlier, no, it was a remote, nomadic region that was separate from the Chinese Empire, until the Manchurians got up and conquered it. So being an old kingdom didn't protect them from being conquered long before they had any major contact with the West. And even though the Chinese weren't officially conquered by the British, they were humiliated by them during the Opium Wars. Now, China had first contact with the Portuguese, or the other way around, in the 1500s. So China had access and information on what the West had to provide, and China chose to isolate. Portugal and other European countries wanted trade with China, but China said, no, we want to keep everything the way it is. We don't want your interference. At this time, China was a much larger economy than all of Europe. They had more resources than all of Europe. They could have easily dominated that part of the world, but they chose to stagnate and get conquered and humiliated in the future because of this. Just remember, guys, if you want isolationism, that doesn't mean the rest of the world is going to do it. So if you want to stifle your growth, the rest of the world won't follow your suit, and eventually they'll take you over. And like I mentioned, the British humiliated the Chinese by delivering a series of defeats against the Qing dynasty, until eventually China just had no choice but to open up the gates of trade to the West. Then, of course, the Chinese were almost conquered by the Japanese during World War II, and 10 years before that. It wasn't until after the war and the Japanese were taken care of by the rest of the West that China was able to actually wrest control from them. Then, of course, after World War II and the Chinese finally threw off the yoke of Japan, they were conquered by a Western ideal, started by primarily Karl Marx, a Westerner. Who is the ruling party of China right now? The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. So China is not even led by an ideology that emerged from China on its own. The main Chinese philosophies are Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, there's legalism, and then of course there's Mohiism. None of those philosophies have taken root in any country and have been able to form a system of government or economy. Mohiism comes slightly close because they do believe in some kind of universal equality, but if you want to compare them, you could see these major differences between Mohiism and communism. And go into the core idea, universal love, meritocracy. But the core idea of communism is a classless, propertyless society. Also, their views on war. They oppose all unjust war and communism except violence during revolution. Also, the focus behind Mohiism is ethics, social harmony, while communism is more economics and absolutely class struggle. And remember, one of the worst famines in human history came from China's Great Leap Forward, and this was when they were a 5,000-year-old society, not to mention the elimination of millions of their brightest people during the Cultural Revolution. So the age of your empire has nothing to do as to whether or not you can resist cultural or military shifts. After this long string of failures, China has learned and they have become a very successful country and economy. They have lifted over 800 million people out of poverty, also out of illiteracy. They are one of the most literate countries on the planet. They are the world's largest manufacturer. Everybody is dependent on Chinese manufacturing. They are, without a doubt, the most influential and powerful economy and military in all of Asia. But all of the advancement that China has gone through over these past 70, 80, even 100 years is because of the influence of the West and the eventual willingness to learn from what the West had to offer. Does this mean that China is going to unseat America as the world's top military and economic power? I still don't think so. I think America has weakened itself, but it'll be a long time before America loses its prominence to any other country. I am the Geo Husar, and I will make a post about why America shouldn't be underestimated tomorrow. Thanks for watching.